She was packing up her life like it was nothing. But when she whispered, "This era ends, but not everything," I realized some goodbyes don't mean it's over. They just mean it still matters. The morning light spilled through the curtains in soft, dusty streaks, catching the edges of the half-packed boxes that crowded her living room. It felt strange, seeing this space, once warm and alive, now fading into echoes. He stood by the doorway, unsure if he was intruding or helping. She didn't ask him to come. He just did. Maybe because part of him needed to witness it, needed to see the end before he could accept it. She moved with unhurried grace, folding her memories into cardboard. A photo frame, a book with worn edges, a vase with a single dried flower she didn't have the heart to throw away. The faint scent of jasmine drifted from her as she passed by, the same scent that always clung to her scarves, her car, her world. He caught himself watching the curve of her shoulders, the quiet determination in her movements, the way she paused before sealing each box, like she was saying a silent goodbye to everything inside. "Careful with that one," she murmured, as he bent to lift a heavy crate marked fragile. Her voice carried that calm steadiness he'd always admired, the kind that could make even endings feel gentle. He smiled faintly. "You sure you don't want me to just take all this and run away with it? Save you the trouble?" She laughed, low, genuine, and warm. It filled the empty room in a way that made his chest ache a little. "You'd be stealing more than boxes then," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He wanted to say, "I know," but instead he kept quiet. Every time she passed something into his hands, their fingers brushed, accidental, fleeting, electric. Each touch left a pulse of warmth that lingered longer than it should have. He wondered if she felt it too or if she'd learned to hide it better. When she lifted a box too heavy for her, he stepped closer, hands covering hers on the edges. "Let me," he said softly. Their eyes met for a second, just one heartbeat of stillness, but it stretched, slow and fragile, like time was holding its breath. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. He noticed small details he never had before. The faint lines near her mouth that deepened when she smiled, the tired grace in her hands, the way her silver bracelet caught the light as she worked. Every moment felt soaked in finality, yet alive with something unnamed. As the afternoon wore on, the rooms grew emptier and his chest heavier. He found himself memorizing everything. The sound of her footsteps on the wooden floor, the rhythm of her breathing, the slight hum she made while thinking. He wanted to remember it all. By the time the sun began to lower, the house looked almost bare. She stood by the window, gazing out at the golden light spreading over the garden. He joined her quietly, neither of them speaking. Somewhere between the fading sunlight and the soft hum of distance, he realized it wasn't just the house she was leaving behind. It was a version of her life he had been quietly a part of. And maybe this move wasn't just her ending. It was his too. By mid-afternoon, the light had softened into that mellow gold that always made the house look like a memory. The boxes now lined the walls like muted sentinels, each one holding fragments of moments too ordinary to ever be photographed. He leaned against the doorframe, wiping dust from his palms, and watched her kneel beside a half-open box filled with books. Her favorites, the ones he used to see stacked by her bedside when he dropped by after work. "You're taking all of them?" he asked quietly. She glanced up, smiling faintly. "Not all. Some stories belong to this place." Her answer made something in his chest tighten. He wanted to ask what she meant, but he knew. Some stories did belong here. The late-night tea in the kitchen when power went out, the sound of rain hitting the glass as they sat in comfortable silence, the first time she'd let him stay when the storm grew too loud outside. Those memories lived in the walls, and maybe that's why the house seemed reluctant to let her go. He joined her on the floor, cross-legged beside her. The wooden boards creaked under their weight, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. For a moment, they just sat there, surrounded by pieces of a life half-packed away. "Remember the first time you came here?" she said suddenly, reaching for a chipped mug resting on a nearby box. "You knocked like you were delivering a sermon." He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. You opened the door like you already knew I'd forgotten why I came. Her laugh came out light, airy, but her eyes softened with something deeper, something that hovered between affection and farewell. He took the mug she offered. It was still warm. Coffee just the way she always made it. A little too strong, a little too honest. They drank in silence. The taste was familiar, grounding. Around them, the afternoon hummed softly, the world outside distant and forgiving. She reached for a small snow globe on the shelf, one he'd once teased her about keeping. Inside, a pair of miniature figures stood beneath falling flakes that never melted. You know, she said, shaking it gently, I used to watch this whenever things felt uncertain, pretend everything could stay like this, suspended, quiet. He looked at her, the reflected snow shimmering in her eyes. Maybe some things can, he said, barely above a whisper. Her hands stilled. For a heartbeat, they didn't move. The air between them felt charged, not with tension, but recognition. A knowing that whatever this was, it wasn't fleeting. When she finally set the globe down, her fingers brushed his. It was an accidental touch, soft, grounding. Yet it spoke louder than words. He didn't pull back. Neither did she. Outside, the sky shifted toward dusk, its colors slipping into melancholy blues. He watched her gather another stack of books and thought, if the walls could speak, they'd tell their story, quiet, slow, unfinished. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready to let that story end. By the time they reached the last few boxes, evening had settled over the house like a sigh. The golden warmth from earlier had deepened into a dusky blue, the kind that makes every sound feel louder, every silence heavier. He followed her down the narrow hallway, the soft thud of their steps echoing off the bare walls. It was strange, this quiet. The house, once filled with her voice, her soft humming, her laughter, now felt almost reverent. Each room they passed seemed to hold its breath, watching them, as if it too understood that this was the last time she'd walk these floors. She stopped by the old bookshelf in the corner, running her hand over the empty space where her novels used to sit. I used to think this house would outlive me, she said, half smiling. Turns out homes move on too. He wanted to say not this one, not for me, but the words stuck somewhere deep in his throat. He could feel the weight of everything he hadn't said pressing against his chest. The gratitude, the admiration, the quiet love that had grown too big for silence. Instead, he only managed, it won't be the same without you. Her hand stilled, fingertips resting on the wood. Things aren't supposed to stay the same, she murmured. They're supposed to mean something while they last. He nodded slowly, but inside, the words hit differently, like a door closing gently but firmly. When she turned toward him, a strand of hair fell across her face. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing it back behind her ear. His fingers lingered a fraction too long, the warmth of her skin searing into his memory. She didn't pull away, just looked at him. Eyes steady, unreadable, but not unkind. For a moment, the world narrowed to that tiny distance between them. A breath, a pulse, the quiet rhythm of two people standing on the edge of something neither dared name. Then she stepped back, clearing her throat softly. There's still the kitchen, she said, her voice light but trembling at the edges. He followed her, wordless. They packed the last of the dishes, their movements slow, deliberate, anything to delay the inevitable. When their hands met again, reaching for the same cup, they both froze. The brush of skin was faint, but it sent a tremor up his arm. She looked down quickly, but he caught the flicker of something in her expression. Hesitation, maybe longing, maybe fear. The silence stretched thin between them, taut and fragile. He thought of all the times he could have told her how much these ordinary days meant to him. The mornings filled with shared laughter, the evenings where they talked until light bled into darkness. But every confession seemed too small for what he felt, and too heavy to offer now at the end. When the last box closed, the final sound, the tape pulling and pressing down, felt final, almost cruel. He stood beside her at the threshold, heart pounding with everything he hadn't said. She exhaled slowly, locking the door one last time. He wanted to ask her to stay, but the silence between them already had its answer. The sky had dimmed into that soft indigo just before night, when the world seems caught between leaving and staying. The driveway glowed faintly under the street lamp as they carried the last box to her car. It wasn't heavy, at least not physically, but each step made it feel like it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. She placed it gently in the trunk, brushed the dust from her palms, and stood for a moment in silence. The air was cool, still carrying the faint warmth of the day, mixed with the lingering scent of her perfume. He shoved his hands into his pockets, unsure whether to speak or just let the moment pass quietly. "You're really doing it," he said finally, his voice low. She looked at him. That same composed, graceful look she always had when she was pretending she wasn't breaking inside. "It's time," she said softly. "This house, it's full of stories, but I need to start new ones." He nodded, though every part of him wanted to tell her that they still had unwritten chapters, that not every story had to end because the setting changed. She closed the trunk slowly and leaned against it, crossing her arms. The faint hum of the neighborhood filled the air. A dog barking in the distance, a car passing by, the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. Everything felt painfully ordinary. And yet, he knew he'd remember this exact soundscape for the rest of his life. He stepped closer. "You'll visit, right?" A small smile played on her lips. "Maybe." There was a pause, not awkward but full. A silence that pulsed with everything they both understood but couldn't give words to. Her gaze drifted toward the house. The windows dark now, the curtains drawn, the home she had built, loved, and was now leaving behind. He wanted to say something, anything, but before he could, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This era ends, but not everything." He froze. The words were quiet, almost carried away by the wind, but they landed deep inside him. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Her eyes held the answer, soft, unguarded, full of that same unspoken warmth that had filled every moment they'd shared. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she reached out, just for a second, and adjusted the collar of his jacket, her fingers brushing lightly against his neck. It wasn't much, but it was everything. "Take care of the garden," she said, her voice steady again. "The lilies will miss the company." He laughed, softly, shakily. "Only if you promise to come check on them." Her smile deepened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she opened the car door, hesitated, and looked at him one last time. There was a kind of peace in her eyes and something else too, something that didn't end. When she finally drove away, the whisper still echoed in his chest, quiet and alive. "This era ends, but not everything." The sound of her engine faded long before he moved. He stood in the driveway until even the faintest trace of her tail lights disappeared beyond the curve of the street. The night had fully arrived, soft, blue, and achingly still. Somewhere, a cicada hummed. A window slammed shut down the block. But for him, everything else had gone quiet. He turned toward the house. Without her laughter, without her voice, it looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The door creaked when he pushed it open, the kind of sound that felt louder now, echoing through the rooms that no longer carried warmth. Inside, the air was thick with the scent she'd left behind. Jasmine, coffee, and something faintly floral, like the perfume she used when she wasn't expecting company. It hit him harder than he expected. He walked through the hallway slowly, his footsteps dull against the wooden floor. The boxes were gone, but the outlines of where they'd stood remained. Pale rectangles on the walls, faint impressions in the carpet. Ghosts of belonging. In the kitchen, 2 mugs still sat in the sink, ringed with the traces of their last shared coffee. He reached for one, fingers trembling slightly, then stopped. Somehow, washing it felt too final. He left them there. The silence pressed closer, familiar and foreign all at once. It was the kind of silence that didn't just fill a room, it filled a person. He found himself walking toward the spot where they'd sat earlier that afternoon, on the floor, backs against the wall, laughing about nothing. Now, The same sunlight that had once poured through the window was gone, replaced by moonlight spilling across the floorboards in cold, silver streaks. He sat down anyway. The boards were cool under his palms, the air faintly damp from the evening breeze sneaking through a cracked window. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries the weight of holding back too much for too long. Memories flickered like film reels. Her turning toward him with that quiet smile, the way her fingers brushed his as she passed a book, the sound of her voice when she said his name like it meant more than she let on. He opened his eyes and stared at the empty room. Every shadow seemed to move like her silhouette. The way she stood by the window, the tilt of her head when she was thinking, the curve of her hand as she reached for another box. He almost said her name out loud. Almost. But he didn't. Instead, he whispered something else. Something simple, fragile, and honest. "You're still here." And in a way, she was. Not in the boxes, not in the walls, but in the quiet rhythm of his heartbeat that refused to settle, in the faint scent still hanging in the air, in the gentle warmth that lingered even after everything else was gone. He leaned back against the wall and let his head rest there. The night pressed close, soft and endless. It wasn't empty. It was just waiting. Days passed. Maybe a week. Time felt unmeasured in the quiet that followed her leaving. Mornings came pale and still. Evenings folded into silence too quickly. He moved through the house like someone afraid to disturb a memory. Careful, slow, half-present. Her absence had shape now. It lived in the way he made only one cup of coffee instead of two, in the stillness that waited at dusk when the light hit the walls just right. Every sound seemed to echo longer than it should. Yet somehow he stayed. Maybe to finish what was left. Maybe because leaving would mean admitting she was truly gone. That morning, the rain came softly. A thin drizzle tapping against the windows, tracing slow patterns down the glass. He decided to finally clean the last of her things. The drawers in her study. He'd been avoiding them. Something about that small wooden desk felt sacred, like touching it would undo everything he was trying to hold together. He opened the first drawer. Pens, old receipts, and an unused candle. The second held a small notebook, a few photos tucked between its pages. Then, as he reached the third, he found it. An envelope, ivory and unsealed, with his name written across the front in her handwriting. He froze. It wasn't a long letter. Just one page, folded carefully, smelling faintly of her perfume. That same familiar jasmine and warmth that always seemed to fill the air around her. He unfolded it slowly, afraid the act itself might make the words disappear. Some people belong not to places, but to moments that never really end. You were one of mine. His breath caught somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. The words were so simple, yet they carried her. The cadence of her thoughts, the gentle certainty she had when saying something she truly meant. He sank into the old chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. Around him, the rain softened into a steady rhythm, each drop blending with the quiet hum of the house. She hadn't said goodbye. Not really. She'd left a continuation. A small, delicate thread that tied her presence to this silence. It wasn't closure. It was an invitation to remember without breaking. He read the words again, slower this time, tracing the ink with his thumb like it might reveal more. And maybe it did. Maybe it wasn't just about her. Maybe it was about him learning to carry something without needing to hold it too tightly. He folded the letter back and placed it gently on the desk. The edges were worn now from where his fingers had lingered too long. For the first time since she left, he smiled. The rain eased, light breaking faintly through the clouds. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It just felt paused. Waiting. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't waiting for her to return. He was waiting to meet her again. Somewhere new, somewhere different. In a world that would know what those words meant. This era ends, but not everything. Months passed quietly, like pages turning on their own. He had settled into a rhythm. Work, silence. Morning walks through the park she once loved. The ache that used to press heavy against his chest had softened into something tender, like a scar that no longer hurt but still remembered. Her letter stayed on his desk, folded neatly, untouched but never forgotten. Sometimes, when the evenings grew still, he'd read the line again. Some people belong not to places, but to moments that never really end. He'd begun to believe it. One Saturday, while running errands in the older part of town, he found himself slowing near a narrow street he'd never noticed before, lined with ivy and small lanterns strung between shop signs. There was a new cafe tucked between an antique bookstore and a flower shop, its windows glowing soft amber in the late afternoon. The name caught his eye. Still, something about it made him stop. Through the glass he saw her. Hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She was arranging a small display of pastries near the counter. Sunlight from the front window spilled across her face, catching faint strands of silver in her hair. She looked calm, lighter even, not changed beyond recognition but somehow more herself. For a long moment he just stood there, letting the sight of her settle into him. It felt unreal, like stepping into a memory he didn't know he was still allowed to have. Then, as if she sensed it, she looked up. Her eyes found his through the glass. No surprise, no startle, just that quiet recognition, the kind that doesn't belong to coincidence. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. He opened the door. The chime above it rang. A soft, familiar note that felt almost like her laughter. The air inside smelled of baked bread and cinnamon, faintly mixed with the same jasmine that had once lived in her old home. "Hi," he said, voice careful, almost reverent. "Hi," she replied, her tone warm, steady, like no time had passed at all. There were 1,000 things he could have said. "I missed you. You left a piece of yourself with me. The lilies bloomed this spring, just like you said they would." But instead, he just smiled back. She poured him coffee, strong, dark, just the way she used to make it. As he took the first sip, the quiet between them settled, no longer heavy, but whole. They talked about simple things. The neighborhood, the cafe, the way the weather had been kind lately. But under every word ran that same undercurrent, soft, certain, alive. When she handed him the bill, he noticed something small scrawled in the corner in her handwriting. "Some stories don't end. They just find new rooms to grow in." He looked up. She met his eyes again, smiling that same gentle, steady smile. The one that once meant goodbye, now rewritten as hello again. And just like that, he knew. She'd been right all along. This era had ended. But not everything.